"I haven't tasted sugar in years," she said, so quietly it barely reached the air, but it stayed there, suspended, as if even the heat didn't dare move it. Mississippi, 1944, the sun already climbing past 90 degrees by mid-morning, pressing down on the cotton fields until the horizon blurred and the ground itself seemed to breathe, and Anna Weiss stood in line with the others, shoulders straight, hands still, her face calm in the way only someone who has stopped expecting anything can be, around her. The women shifted slightly, not from impatience, but from the weight of waiting, always waiting, for orders, for food, for something that never came the way it should, and then the smell arrived before anything else, faint at first, almost imagined, warm, sweet, unfamiliar, cutting through the thick air like a memory that didn't belong here, cinnamon, sugar, something baked, something soft, and it moved through them like a whisper, not spoken but felt, a ripple across a line of women who had trained themselves not to react, not to show hunger, not to show anything at all, and still, something changed, barely visible, a shift in breathing, a stillness that deepened instead of breaking, because sweetness was not just food, it was something dangerous, something tied to before, to kitchens with open windows and mornings that had nothing to do with survival, and no one here trusted that kind of memory, not anymore. And when the tray appeared, carried in steady hands by Corporal James Whitaker, there was no announcement, no explanation, just a quiet placement on a wooden crate at the edge of the field, a dozen cinnamon rolls, still warm, icing beginning to melt under the rising heat, the smell stronger now, undeniable, filling the space between them, and no one moved, not a step, not a hand, because this was how mistakes happened. This was how you reached for something you weren't supposed to have and paid for it later, and Whitaker said nothing, he didn't look at them the way guards usually did, didn't measure, didn't command, he just stood there for a moment, then reached down, picked one up, broke it apart slowly, the soft bread pulling in strands, steam escaping into the heavy air, and he took a bite, no performance, no gesture, just a man eating, chewing, swallowing, and waiting, and that was when Anna noticed something she hadn't expected, not kindness, not yet, but absence, the absence of threat, the absence of demand, the absence of anything that needed to be answered, and it unsettled her more than anything else could have, because she knew how to endure cruelty, she knew how to survive hunger, but this quiet offering with no condition, no explanation, it didn't fit anywhere in the world she understood, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what was supposed to happen next. The line did not move, but something inside it shifted, almost invisible, like wind passing through tall grass that no one admitted to seeing, and Anna felt it before she understood it, the way the woman beside her adjusted her stance, the way another lowered her gaze just slightly, not toward the ground but toward the crate, toward the tray, toward something none of them had allowed themselves to want, and still no one stepped forward, because discipline had been learned slowly, reinforced by months of scarcity, by the simple rule that reaching first meant losing something later, and so they waited, not out of obedience, but out of survival, and the silence stretched, thick as the heat pressing against their skin, until it became something else, something heavier, something that demanded a choice, and Anna realized that the moment had already begun without them, that whatever this was, it would not wait forever. And across from them Whitaker shifted his weight once, not impatient, not expectant, just present, as if he understood that the next movement did not belong to him, and that was what unsettled her most, because every system she had known depended on control, on orders, on someone deciding when something began and when it ended, but here there was only space, and in that space she could feel the others looking without looking, waiting without admitting it, and she thought of the last time she had tasted anything sweet, not clearly, not as a memory she could hold, but as a feeling, something soft at the edge of her mind, something that had not been needed to survive and therefore had disappeared first, and she wondered, not if the food was real, but if the part of her that could receive it still existed, and her hand moved before she had decided to move it, not quickly, not boldly, just forward, one step that felt louder than any command she had ever followed, and she could feel the line behind her hold its breath, not stopping her, not urging her, just witnessing, and when she reached the crate she did not look at Whitaker, not yet, because this was not about him, this was about something she had carried for too long, something that had turned every offer into a question, every kindness into a calculation, and she picked up the smallest piece she could find. A fragment where the icing had melted into the folds of the bread, her fingers hesitating not from fear but from unfamiliarity, because warmth was not something they were used to holding, and for a moment she simply stood there, the piece in her hand, the scent rising, the world narrowing to something almost unbearably simple, and then she brought it to her mouth, not with urgency, not with hunger, but with a kind of careful attention, as if she were testing not the food but reality itself, and the moment the taste reached her, everything inside her paused, not broken, not shattered, just stopped, like a clock that had been wound too tight finally releasing its tension, and she did not react the way anyone would expect, she did not gasp, she did not speak, she just stood there, eyes closed, breathing slowly, as if she needed time to understand what had just happened, and behind her, the line did not remain still anymore. The change did not come as a rush, it came as permission, slow and uncertain, like something long locked beginning to loosen, and one by one the women behind Anna stepped forward, not all at once, not in a line of hunger, but in small, careful movements, each of them deciding for themselves that this moment would not be taken away, and the air shifted, no longer held tight by suspicion but opening, just enough to let something human pass through, and Anna remained where she stood. The taste still resting on her tongue, not fading, not overwhelming, just present, and it was not the sweetness that held her there, it was what came with it, the memory of mornings before the war, of kitchens filled with light instead of silence, of hands that baked not because they had to but because they wanted to give something warm to someone else, and she had not realized how much of that had disappeared until it returned all at once, not as a clear picture but as a feeling she could not push away, and her fingers tightened slightly around the small piece she still held, as if it might vanish if she did not hold it carefully, and behind her she could hear it now, not voices, not conversation, but something softer, the quiet sound of breathing changing, of people allowing themselves to experience something without immediately questioning it, and when she opened her eyes she saw that the tray was no longer untouched, that hands had reached, hesitant at first, then steadier, each woman taking only what she needed, no more, no less, as if they understood instinctively that this was not abundance to be consumed but a moment to be respected, and Whitaker had stepped back without anyone noticing when, giving space not as a gesture but as a decision, removing himself from the center of something he had started but did not need to control, and Anna finally looked at him, not searching for intention, not trying to understand his reasons, but simply seeing him as he was in that moment, a man standing in the heat, hands empty now, watching without expectation, and it was that absence again that unsettled her, the absence of demand, the absence of any claim over what he had given, and she realized that whatever this was, it did not belong to him anymore, it belonged to them, to what they chose to do with it, and for the first time since arriving she felt something unfamiliar, not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it, fragile and unspoken, and she turned slightly, looking at the others as they stood closer now, not touching, not speaking, but no longer separated by the same invisible distance that had defined every moment before this one, and in that quiet space, with the sun high and the air still heavy, something had changed in a way that could not be measured. Something that did not show in posture or expression but existed nonetheless, and Anna understood without needing to say it that this moment would not end when the food was gone, that it would remain, carried forward in the way they looked at the next gesture, the next silence, the next choice, and for the first time she wondered not how long she would endure, but what might still be possible if the world was not exactly as she had been told. The last piece was taken slowly, not because there was not enough, but because no one wanted to be the one who ended it, and when the tray finally stood empty, the air did not return to what it had been before, it remained altered, quieter in a different way, as if something unseen had settled between them, and the women stepped back into their places without being told, not out of habit this time, but out of choice, carrying with them something that could not be seen in their hands, and Anna felt it most clearly in the way her body no longer held the same tension, not relaxed, not safe, but no longer braced for something that had not come, and that absence continued to echo, louder now than any command, and across the field Whitaker picked up the empty tray, brushing a bit of flour from its edge with his thumb, not looking at anyone in particular, not searching for acknowledgement, and that, more than anything else, stayed with her, because in every system she had known, every action demanded a response, a thank you, a nod, a recognition of hierarchy, but here there was none, just a man returning to his place as if what had happened required no explanation at all, and the work resumed, rows of cotton stretching out under a sky that had not changed, the sun still pressing down past 95 degrees, the air still thick enough to feel with each breath, and yet the rhythm was different now, not faster, not easier, just altered in a way that could not be named, and Anna moved through the rows with the same steady precision, her hands working the plants, her steps measured, but something inside her no longer followed the same pattern, because the taste had not disappeared, it lingered, faint but present, returning in small waves that had nothing to do with hunger, and she found herself noticing things she had stopped seeing, the way the light caught on the edges of the leaves, the distant sound of a truck on a gravel road, the subtle shift in the breeze that had not been there before, and it confused her, not because these things were new, but because she had forgotten they existed, and as the hours passed, the memory of the morning did not fade into something distant, it remained close, shaping the way she understood each moment that followed, and when the midday break came, no one spoke of what had happened, no one referenced the tray or the food or the silence that had changed everything, but the distance between them was no longer the same, and when Anna sat on the edge of the field, resting her hands in her lap, she became aware of something she had not felt in a long time, not relief, not comfort, but space, a small opening inside her where something new could exist without immediately being pushed away, and she did not trust it, not yet, but she did not reject it either, and across the field, Whitaker leaned against the side of a truck, drinking from a metal canteen, his posture unchanged, his presence no different than it had been before, and yet she knew, without needing to understand how, that the line between what had been and what could be had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not return to where it had been, and as she looked down at her hands, still steady, still capable, she realized that survival had always been about enduring what was given, but this required something else entirely, something she was not sure she remembered how to do. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, the kind of quiet that was not empty but filled with something unspoken, and the sun did not soften as it moved across the sky, it remained constant, pressing down past 95 degrees, turning every breath into effort, every step into repetition, and yet the rhythm of the field had changed in a way that did not show on the surface, because the women still worked as they had before, steady, precise, disciplined, but there was something beneath it now. Something that moved differently, and Anna felt it most in the spaces between actions, in the brief pauses when her hands stilled for just a second longer than necessary, in the way her thoughts no longer returned immediately to the same narrow path of endurance, and she did not welcome it, not fully, because anything unfamiliar carried risk. And hope, even in its smallest form, had always been the most dangerous thing to hold, and still it remained, quiet but present, like the faint taste that had not left her, and as the light began to shift, stretching shadows across the rows, she became aware of the others in a new way, not as a line, not as a group defined by the same condition, but as individuals moving beside her, each carrying their own version of what had happened that morning, and she noticed how one of the older women adjusted her scarf more carefully than before, how another paused to look toward the horizon for just a moment longer, as if measuring something she could not name, and none of them spoke of it, not because it was forbidden, but because it did not need to be spoken, and across the field Whitaker moved between tasks, checking equipment, speaking briefly to a foreman, his presence consistent, unchanged. And yet Anna found herself aware of him in a way she had not been before, not watching him, not seeking him out, but noticing the absence of tension when he passed near, the lack of that instinctive tightening that had once been automatic, and it unsettled her again, because it suggested a shift she could not control, and control had been the only thing she had left, the ability to close off, to expect nothing, to move through each day without allowing anything to alter the balance she had built inside herself. And now that balance had been disturbed by something as simple as bread and sugar and a gesture that asked for nothing in return, and she wondered, not for the first time, what the cost of that disturbance would be, because every change carried consequence, even the quiet ones, and when the work finally slowed and the signal came to gather, the women moved together toward the edge of the field, not in silence this time, but in a different kind of quiet, one that held awareness instead of distance. And Anna walked with them, her steps measured, her posture unchanged. But inside her something had begun to shift in a way that could not be undone, and as she reached the edge and paused, just for a moment, she glanced once more toward the place where the tray had stood that morning, now empty, now ordinary again, and she understood something she had not expected, that the moment itself had already passed, but what it had opened had not, and whatever came next would not be shaped by what they had been told, but by what they had now seen with their own eyes. The evening did not arrive all at once, it eased and slowly, the light thinning across the fields until the harsh white of the afternoon softened into something quieter, something that did not press as hard against the skin, and the air, though still warm, began to move again, just enough to be felt, just enough to remind them that the day had an end, and Anna walked with the others toward the transport truck, her step steady, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharpened in a way that made every detail clearer, the crunch of dry dirt beneath worn shoes, the distant hum of insects rising with the fading heat, the low murmur of voices that had not been there before, not loud, not open, but present, and she realized that something else had shifted, something even more subtle than before, because the silence that had once defined them had begun to loosen, not breaking, not disappearing, but allowing space for something else to exist alongside it, and she heard it in fragments, a word exchanged, a quiet observation, a tone that carried no fear, and it unsettled her in a different way, because it meant that the change was not contained to a single moment, it was continuing, moving forward into everything that followed, and she was not sure where it would lead, and as they reached the truck, the wooden sides worn smooth from years of use, the metal frame still holding the heat of the day, they climbed in one by one, taking their places on the narrow benches, hands resting on laps, shoulders no longer as rigid as they had been that morning, and Anna sat near the edge, her gaze moving briefly across the field they had just left, the rows stretching out into the dimming light, the place where the tray had stood now indistinguishable from the rest, and yet she knew it was not the same, that something invisible remained there, something that had already carried forward with them, and Whitaker stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with another man, his tone even, his posture unchanged, and she watched him for a moment, not out of curiosity, not searching for meaning, but because she could not ignore the absence she felt in his presence, the absence of pressure, of expectation, of anything that demanded a response, and it created a space she did not know how to fill, and when his gaze passed briefly over the group, it did not stop, did not linger. It moved on as if there was nothing to measure, nothing to assess, and that, more than anything, stayed with her, because it suggested a different kind of order, one she had not been taught to understand, and the engine started with a low vibration that moved through the frame of the truck, a steady rhythm that carried them away from the field, the landscape shifting slowly as they drove, cotton rows giving way to open land, then to the faint outline of buildings in the distance, and no one spoke loudly, no one tried to define what had happened, but the quiet that filled the truck was no longer empty, it held something shared, something understood without words, and Anna sat with her hands still in her lap, feeling the faint trace of warmth that had long since faded from her fingers but had not disappeared entirely, and she realized that the day had not ended in the way she expected, it had not closed, it had not returned to its starting point, it had continued forward, carrying with it a question she could not ignore, not about the man, not about the food, but about what it meant when something small, something simple, could change the shape of everything that came after, and as the truck moved steadily down the dirt road, she understood that whatever this was, it was not finished, it had only just begun. Night settled over the camp without ceremony, the last light slipping behind the low buildings as if it had nothing more to give, and the air cooled just enough to be noticed, a faint relief after the weight of the day, and Anna lay on her narrow bunk, hands folded over her stomach, staring at the wooden ceiling above her, the grain of the boards faintly visible in the dim light that filtered through the small window. And around her the others moved quietly, some sitting, some lying down. Their presence no longer marked by the same rigid silence that had filled the space before, and she could hear it now, not conversation exactly, but fragments of sound, the soft exchange of words in low voices, the kind that did not carry far but did not need to, and she turned her head slightly, listening without appearing to listen, because something in her wanted to understand what had changed. And one of the younger women spoke first, her voice careful, almost unsure, describing the taste. In simple terms, not exaggerating, not trying to relive it, just stating it as something real, something that had happened, and another responded, not with disbelief, but with recognition, adding her own memory, her own version of something similar from a different time, a different place, and the words moved slowly through the room, not building into anything loud or emotional, but creating a quiet thread that connected them in a way that had not existed before, and Anna remained still, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, but her thoughts no longer held in the same tight pattern, because the moment from the morning had not stayed in the field, it had followed them here, settling into the space between them, altering it in ways that could not be undone, and she became aware of something else, something even more unfamiliar, the absence of fear in these small exchanges, the absence of the instinct to pull back, to protect, to remain separate, and it unsettled her, not because it was wrong, but because it was new, and new things required decisions, and decisions required something she had avoided for a long time, and she closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to steady the movement inside her, and the taste returned again, faint but unmistakable, not as strong as before, but enough to remind her that it had been real, that it had not been imagined. And with it came the same question that had followed her since the afternoon, not about the man, not about the gesture, but about what it meant to accept something without suspicion, to allow something to exist without immediately preparing for its loss, and she did not have an answer, not yet, and across the room one of the women let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, not loud, not forced, just a natural release of something that had been held too long, and it did not draw attention, it did not break the calm, it simply existed, and Anna felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that did not come from outside but from within, a small loosening of the hold she had kept on herself, and she did not resist it, not completely, and as the room settled into a softer quiet, the sounds fading one by one, she understood that the day had not ended with the truck ride, it had continued here, in this room, in these voices, in the way something shared could exist without being taken away, and as she lay there, eyes open in the dim light, she realized that whatever had begun was no longer contained to a single moment, it had entered the space where choices were made, and whether she wanted it or not, it would be there when morning came again. Morning did not wait for her to be ready, it arrived the same way it always did, pale light pushing through the window, air still carrying the last trace of night before the heat returned, and Anna opened her eyes to the quiet before movement, that brief moment where nothing had begun yet, and for a second she did not remember, not the field, not the tray, not the taste, and then it came back, not as a thought but as a presence, something already there before she could decide what to do with it. And she sat up slowly, the wooden frame of the bunk creaking softly beneath her, and around her the others were waking too, not with urgency, not with the same tight routine that had defined every morning before, but with a subtle difference, a pause here, a glance there, as if each of them was carrying something forward from the day before, something they had not set down during the night, and no one spoke about it, no one needed to, because it existed in the way they moved, in the way they did not rush to rebuild the distance that had once felt necessary, and Anna stood, smoothing her dress with practiced hands, her movements still precise, still controlled, but her awareness different, wider, taking in more than just what was required, and when they stepped outside, the air already warming, the sky clear and open, she felt it again, that faint sense of something unfinished, not a question waiting for an answer, but a moment waiting to continue, and as they were gathered and led toward the truck, the routine unfolding as it always had, she found herself looking ahead instead of down, not searching, not expecting, just aware, and the road stretched out before them in the same familiar way, dust rising beneath the tires, the landscape unchanged, and yet it did not feel the same, because she was no longer moving through it in the same way, and when they reached the field, the rows standing in their ordered lines, the sun climbing steadily toward another hot day, there was no sign of anything different, no indication that the previous day had been anything other than ordinary, and for a moment she wondered if it had all been contained to that single point in time, if it had no place here in the repetition that followed. And the work began again, hands moving, steps measured, the rhythm returning, and still something remained just beneath it, quiet but persistent, and then she saw it, not immediately, not clearly, but gradually, as her eyes adjusted, a small shape near the edge of the field, placed with the same quiet intention as before, not announced, not emphasized, simply present, and she felt the shift before anyone moved, the awareness passing through the line once more, not as sharp as the first time, not as uncertain, but deeper, steadier, and this time it was not disbelief that held them still, it was something else, something closer to understanding, and Anna did not step forward right away, she remained where she was, watching, not the object itself, but the space around it, the way the moment unfolded without being forced, and she realized that what had begun the day before had not been an exception, it was a pattern, quiet and deliberate. And that meant something more than a single act of kindness, it meant consistency, it meant intention, and those were things that could not be dismissed easily, and as she stood there, the sun rising higher, the heat beginning to build, she understood that the choice in front of her was no longer about whether the moment was real, it was about what she would allow it to become, and for the first time, she did not feel the need to retreat from that question. This time, the stillness did not come from fear, it came from recognition, and the women did not freeze in place the way they had before, they paused, yes, but it was a different kind of pause, one that held awareness instead of doubt, and Anna felt it move through them like a quiet current, not forcing, not pulling, just present, and she watched as one of the older women stepped forward first, not hesitant, not rushed, simply continuing what had already begun the day before, and there was no need for proof this time, no need for demonstration, because something had already been established, something that did not require repetition to be believed, and Whitaker stood at the edge of the field again, not closer, not further, his position unchanged, his presence steady, and he did not move to explain, did not speak, did not draw attention to what he had done. And Anna understood then that this was not about convincing them, it was about allowing them to choose, to step forward or not, to accept or refuse without consequence, and that freedom, small as it was, carried a weight she had not expected, because it placed the decision entirely in her hands, and for a moment she remained where she was, feeling that weight, measuring it, not against fear this time, but against something else, something quieter, something that had begun to form beneath the surface of everything she had known. And when she finally moved, it was not with the same uncertainty as before. It was deliberate, steady, a step that did not question itself, and as she reached the crate, she noticed the details she had missed the day before, the way the bread had been arranged, not perfectly, not carefully, just enough to be shared, the slight unevenness of the icing where it had melted and settled, the warmth still held within it despite the rising heat, and she picked up a piece without hesitation, her fingers no longer unfamiliar with the sensation, and when she tasted it, the reaction was different, not the same breaking, not the same overwhelming return, but something deeper, something that settled instead of shattered, and she realized that the first moment had been about remembering, about the sudden return of something lost, but this was about accepting that it could remain, that it did not have to disappear as quickly as it had come, and around her the others moved in the same quiet rhythm, each taking their share, each carrying their own version of what this meant, and there were no tears this time, no visible release, just a steadiness that had not been there before, and Anna stepped back, the piece in her hand already gone, the taste still present, but now it was not alone, it was accompanied by something else. Something she could not fully name yet, and she turned slightly, her gaze passing over Whitaker, and for the first time she did not look away immediately, not out of defiance, not out of need, but simply because there was no reason to, and in that brief moment, there was no exchange, no acknowledgement, nothing that marked it as significant, and yet she understood that it was, because the distance that had once defined everything between them had shifted again, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer absolute, and as the work resumed, the field returning to its steady rhythm, Anna carried that understanding with her, not as a conclusion, but as something still unfolding, something that would continue to shape what came next, and she no longer saw the moment as an interruption to endure, but as a part of the pattern itself, something that belonged within the day, within the work, within the space they now occupied together. And for the first time, she did not feel the need to protect herself from it. By midday, the pattern no longer felt new, it felt established, not in a way that drew attention to itself, but in the way something repeated begins to settle into the structure of a day, and the field held it quietly, the rows of cotton stretching beneath a sky that had climbed once again past 95 degrees, the heat returning with the same steady pressure, and yet the space within it had changed. Because the moment at the crate was no longer isolated, it had become part of the rhythm, something expected without being demanded, and Anna moved through the rows with the same measured precision, her hands working, her steps consistent, but her awareness now carried an additional layer, one that did not distract, but remained present alongside everything else, and she noticed how the others moved differently too, not dramatically, not in ways that would draw notice from a distance, but in small adjustments, in the way they no longer avoided standing near one another, in the way their movements occasionally aligned without intention, as if the invisible distance between them had narrowed just enough to allow something shared to exist. And she realized that what had begun as a single gesture had extended beyond the act itself. It had altered the way they occupied the same space, and across the field Whitaker continued his work as he always had, checking equipment, speaking when necessary, remaining otherwise silent, and there was no indication that he expected anything in return, no sign that he was observing them for reaction, and that absence continued to shape the moment more than any presence could have, because it removed the need for performance, the need to respond in a certain way, and in that absence something more genuine had begun to take form. Something that did not depend on being seen or acknowledged, and Anna found herself thinking not about the gesture itself, but about what it revealed, about the possibility that not every action carried an unseen cost, that not every moment of ease was followed by something that would take it away, and the thought did not settle easily, it moved through her carefully, as if testing the boundaries of what she would allow. And she did not fully accept it, not yet, but she did not reject it either. And as the hours passed, the repetition of work no longer erased what had happened earlier, it carried it forward, integrating it into each movement, each breath, and when the break came again, the women gathered without hesitation, not rushing, not holding back, simply continuing what had already been established, and Anna stood among them, no longer separate in the same way, no longer positioned at the edge of something uncertain, but within it, part of the quiet structure that had formed. And as she took her place, she realized that the change was no longer something she observed, it was something she was participating in, and that realization carried a different kind of weight, one that did not press down but expanded outward, creating space instead of limiting it, and she understood that whatever this was, it was no longer fragile in the way it had been at the beginning, it had endured a full cycle of the day, it had returned, and in that return it had gained something stronger than the first moment could have held, it had become part of what came next. The second break came without announcement, the same quiet gathering at the edge of the field, the same absence of instruction, and yet something had shifted again, not in what was done, but in what followed, because this time the women did not return immediately to their places when it was over, they lingered, not in hesitation, but in a kind of stillness that allowed something else to surface, and Anna felt it before she understood it, the way the moment did not close as quickly as before. The way the space held them just a little longer, and she noticed one of the women step aside, not toward the truck, not toward the rows, but toward a small patch of ground near the crate, kneeling briefly, brushing something from her hands, and at first it seemed like nothing, just another movement in a day filled with them, but then another followed, and another, each of them placing something small, something almost invisible, a few threads, a folded piece of cloth, a small, carefully shaped bit of bread saved from their own rations, and Anna watched, not interrupting, not questioning, because she understood without needing to be told that this was not an exchange in the way the world usually defined it, it was not payment, it was not obligation, it was something else, something quieter, something that came from the same place as the gesture that had started all of this, and she felt the weight of it settle in her chest. Not heavy, not pressing, but present, and when she moved, it was with the same quiet intention, stepping forward, not toward the tray, but toward that small space that had begun to take shape, and she paused, her hands empty, because she had nothing prepared, nothing saved, and for a moment she considered stepping back, letting the moment pass without her, but something held her there, something that had grown stronger with each repetition, and she reached into the pocket of her dress, her fingers closing around the only thing she carried that was not necessary, a small piece of fabric, worn but clean. Something she had kept without knowing why, and she placed it down gently among the others, not arranging it, not drawing attention to it, just letting it become part of what had been created, and when she stepped back, the space remained unchanged in appearance, small, simple, easy to overlook, but she knew that it held something that could not be measured, something that existed in the act itself, in the decision to respond not with words, not with obligation, but with something chosen freely. And she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the group, and for the first time there was a shared understanding that did not rely on silence alone, it existed in what they had done, in what they had added to the moment, and across the field Whitaker remained where he was, not approaching, not acknowledging, his presence unchanged, and she realized that this was what made it possible, the fact that nothing was required, Nothing was expected, that the space remained open for whatever they chose to place within it, and as the moments slowly dissolved back into the rhythm of the day, the women returning to their work, Anna carried with her the realization that something new had taken form, not just acceptance, not just trust, but participation, and that made the difference complete, because it meant that the moment no longer belonged to a single act, it belonged to all of them, shaped by what they chose to bring into it. And she understood then that this was not the end of what had begun, it was the point where it became something more. The light began to fade again, slower this time, as if the day itself was reluctant to close over what had taken shape within it, and the field carried the traces of what had happened, not in marks or objects, but in the way the space felt inhabited differently, and Anna moved through the final rows with steady hands, her movements unchanged in form but altered in meaning, because she was no longer working only to endure the hours. She was moving within something that now held more than survival, and the heat softened into a warm stillness, the kind that allowed breath to come easier, and as the signal came to gather, the women stepped back from the rows not as separate figures returning to a fixed pattern, but as individuals carrying something shared, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and Anna paused once more at the edge of the field, her gaze moving toward the small space near the crate, the place where the offerings had been left, and it remained simple, unchanged in appearance, but she could feel its presence, the quiet weight of it, and she realized that what had been placed there was not meant to be taken back, not meant to be measured or counted, it existed only in the act of giving, and that realization settled into her with a clarity she had not expected, because it stood in direct contrast to everything she had known before, where every exchange carried balance, where every gesture had a counterpart, and here there was none, only the choice to give without securing anything in return, and she understood then that this was what had shifted everything, not the food, not the taste, but the absence of transaction, the removal of the need to calculate, and she turned as the others moved toward the truck, joining them without hesitation, her step steady, her posture unchanged, but something within her now aligned differently, and as they climbed aboard, the evening air moving gently through the open sides, carrying with it the scent of earth and distance, she sat near the edge again, her hands resting in her lap, and across the space Whitaker stood briefly before turning away, his role in the moment already complete, not extended, not emphasized. And she watched him for a second longer than before, not searching for meaning, but recognizing something she had not seen clearly until now, that he had never stepped into the space that had formed, he had only opened it, and then allowed it to exist without him, and that was what had made everything possible, and as the truck began to move, the road stretching out beneath them, the field receding into the distance, Anna felt a quiet steadiness settle within her, not fragile, not uncertain, but grounded in something she could now recognize, and she understood that what had begun as a single moment had become a structure, something that could continue, something that did not depend on repetition to exist, because it had already taken root in the way they chose to respond, and as the camp came into view, the low buildings outlined against the dimming sky, she realized that the day had not simply passed, it had transformed, and whatever came next would not return to what it had been before, because the standard by which she now measured the world had changed, and she did not need to speak it for it to be real. Night returned with the same quiet certainty, settling over the camp as if it had always belonged there, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of earth and wood, and Anna lay once again on her narrow bunk, her hands resting loosely instead of held tight, her gaze no longer fixed but drifting, as if it had learned that it did not need to stay in one place to remain steady, and around her the room held a different kind of silence, not empty, not guarded, but full in a way that did not require sound to be understood, and she listened without turning her head, aware of the soft movements of the others, the quiet exchanges that no longer felt like a risk, and she realized that what had changed was not only how they saw the day, but how they inhabited the night, because the distance that had once followed them everywhere had begun to fade, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer defining every space they entered, and she closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, but to feel the absence of something she had carried for too long, the constant readiness, the expectation that every moment would demand something from her, and it was not gone, not completely, but it had loosened, just enough to allow something else to exist beside it, and that was what remained with her, not the taste, not the gesture itself, but the realization that the world did not always follow the pattern she had been taught to trust, That there were spaces where nothing was taken, where something could be given without being counted, and she understood that this did not erase what had come before, it did not change the war or the reason she was here, but it changed the way she would move through what remained, and as the room settled into stillness, the last sounds fading into the quiet of sleep, she held on to that understanding, not tightly, not as something fragile, but as something that had proven itself through repetition, and she knew that when morning came again, the field would still be there, the heat would still rise, the work would still demand the same steady rhythm, but she would not arrive as the same person who had first stepped into that space, because something within her had shifted in a way that did not depend on circumstance, and across the distance, in another part of the camp, Whitaker moved through his own routine, unseen, unacknowledged, his role in the moment already passed, and she realized that it did not matter whether he understood what had been set in motion, because the change no longer belonged to him, it existed independently, carried forward by those who had chosen to receive it, and as sleep finally came, not heavy, not forced, but natural, she understood something with a clarity that did not need words. That dignity did not return through grand gestures or loud declarations, it returned quietly, in small, consistent acts that asked for nothing, and in that quiet, something stronger than survival had taken root, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed.